Good morning, UMC. I am Brendan Voss, the summer intern, and I will be leading the Fireside Chat slash interview. And currently, there are no fires blazing. It is a wonderful 9:19 a.m. in the morning when we're recording this, but I am bound and determined to have a great chat with a former professor of mine, Dr. Morrey Davis. And so Dr. Davis, he taught a Methodist history class last fall when I was still able to be in person at Yale Divinity School. And I'm so grateful that Dr. Davis is joining us here this morning. Just to give you a little bit of background on Dr. Davis, he is the son of two Methodist missionaries. And so he had the unique experience of growing up in Zambia. And when he came back to the United States, he attended Houghton College, where he got a BA in history with a minor in music. Then he moved on to Drew University, where he achieved a master's in philosophy with this distinction. And he now has his PhD also from Drew, from the Kasperson School of Graduate Studies. And so those are some of the professional attributes of Dr. Davis. He also has numerous articles and he also has numerous presentations. It might also interest you for our present conversation that he wrote a book back in 2008. And that book's title is The Methodist Unification, Christianity and the Politics of Race in the Jim Crow Era. And so Dr. Davis does not just spend all of his time in classrooms or on Zoom, but he also loves to go mountain bike riding, and he really just loves to be in the outdoors. And so that is a very brief and all too brief introduction for Dr. Davis. But I just want to go straight in and start asking questions here. And so, Dr. Davis, you are in a unique position, I think, as a Methodist historian to really talk about the framing of history that we have and the way that we view history. And so, I think as Methodists, there is probably not a better start, or a more well, just not a better way to start. We're doing this live here, folks. I'm just going to keep going no matter how I bumble through my words. So, as a Methodist historian, we have a relationship with a man by the name of John Wesley, who happened to be in the mood for starting movements, and he happened to feel like starting the Methodist movement back when he was attending in his own university days. And during this time, when he had his band of brethren around him, they happened to focus on a lot of different social issues. And so in our current context, we are talking a lot about the criminal justice system, and we're talking about justice in general. And so the first question that I wanted to ask you was, could you talk a little bit about John Wesley and John Wesley's relationship to different social issues like criminal justice reform and prisons in his native England?
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. It's really good to be here talking to you again, even though we're a lot farther away than the last time I saw you. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for asking me to do this. Hard to know where to start with John Wesley, obviously, but let's get directly at the way you asked the question, which is about the context, the contemporary context we're in, the moment we're in, where it seems like everybody in the United States is at least conscious of a renewed conversation around criminal justice reform, with calls all the way from the way the police treat people they're dealing with to calls to abolish police to somewhere in the middle around reform on all edges. So in the context of a denomination, a very reasonable question, especially Methodists who talk about John Wesley all the time, would be to say, well, what did the founder have to say about these kinds of things? And And we've chatted before about what it means to go back to the founder. We can maybe get to that question later, but let's get directly to what John Wesley had to say, or at least what he wrote about criminal justice reform in the 18th century. And let me just say, in a literal way, he had nothing to say about criminal justice reform in the 18th century, which is not to say that he didn't care about people who were imprisoned in England. Those are very different things. One way to think about this is of course, historical context. One of my favorite tools for the way we look back on history is to use a Google tool called the Ngram Viewer. That's N-gram. If you've never used it, I highly recommend it. It's one of the funnest things available to us from the Google suite. And what it does is it goes back and searches any word or any phrase throughout every book that Google's ever scanned. And that's in the billions of books. So if you, for instance, search the phrase social justice on the Ngram Viewer, it shows you a nice chart about when it first was used, and then spikes for when it was printed the most, and so on. It doesn't appear on the Ngram Viewer until the late 19th century. So in other words, no one in 18th century England was talking about social justice in the way that contemporary Christians will talk about social justice. So that's one contextual difference, is the way in which we think about systemic issues, the way we even talk about systemic problems now is very different from the 18th century, not just in language, but in a conceptual way too. The second thing, though, is that as many people probably already know, is that Wesley was very interested in those in prison. He and his friends at Oxford in the 1730s, one of the things that they did together was they would go to prisons and visit people who were in prison. They would take food, they would go and read with them, they would go and pray with them. And Wesley even kept up correspondence with some young men that he met in prison. That continued for several years, and he recommended it to those in his movement who were pastors, and certainly even those in the lay movements in the societies that he built. So he very much considered thinking about those who were in prison as part of his parish, to use familiar Methodist language. And he understood that visiting those in prison was something that Scripture instructed Christians to do. So that's all a part of how we understand or think about what Wesley thought about prisoners, the prison system. But he doesn't really, in any of his writings, talk about prison reform. In fact, Wesley very rarely talks about systemic, cultural, legal, or social reform, not in the way that we would talk about it. Wesley was very much in his era, certainly in the 18th century, a little bit of a political conservative, in the sense that he didn't have a problem with monarchy. He certainly didn't have a problem with the church hierarchy. He didn't have a problem, or certainly much in any critical way, in a structural way, have a problem with the structure of the Church of England. The Episcopal system was perfectly fine with him. That doesn't mean he agreed with all the things bishops said, but he never went back and said, we need to get rid of bishops, for instance. So in a pretty common sense way, he's a conservative. He's not about changing the system as it exists in England at the time. There are certainly things he spoke out against, and one of the most well-known among Methodists might be he spoke out against slavery. And I wouldn't call him an activist on the issue in the way we would use the word, but he certainly made it known that slavery was a scourge. It was a real stain on all things Christian, as long as governments and churches participated or refused to speak out against slavery. So, yes, he cared about those in prisons. No, he wasn't worried about the systemic issues necessarily that got people there. What Wesley was most concerned about, in fact, if you were to ask him, this is a thing historians are not supposed to do, but I think if you ask Wesley a question from a more contemporary context, he would say, you don't fix systems unless you first fix individuals. So for him, his renewal, right, his preaching of renewal and inner renewal was all about hearts are changed first. When hearts are changed, then the outward relationships are changed. And so it begins with him, as it does in many contemporary evangelical contexts, that individual conversion is the first step to social change, not the other way around. I know that a lot of liberal United Methodists don't want to hear that, But that is very much the way he understood the relationship between Christian conversion and social issues. We could talk longer about that if you want, but I feel like that gets at the
I think even liberal United Methodists need to hear the hard truth sometimes, and to have that right context. So thank you for that. What about, so we talking about John Wesley, and I think John Wesley, he definitely had a unique context in being so ingrained, not only just for him personally, but also his family, being ingrained into the Church of England and having those ties, and not really having much experience outside of a pretty miserable experience in Georgia, but not really having a lot of experience in America. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about those early Methodist leaders in an American context and how they were either similar to or differed from Wesley, who was pretty, maybe love is a strong word, but let's just say, he was at least put into and appreciated and worked with the systems that he had. So those people in America who needed new systems to be able to work in a completely new context, that's a long-winded way of saying, what about early Methodist leaders in America, in North America, and how they viewed these different societal issues as well?
Yeah, even in the colonial era and into the early republic, so meaning before the Revolution and after, most Methodist leaders in North America would have been pretty similar in the way that they thought about society, the way they thought about social issues, or whether they didn't think about social issues. And that is not to say, I don't want to confuse saying that Christian leaders or Methodist leaders weren't concerned with social issues. I don't want to confuse that with didn't care about people, right? It's really about the way in which they conceived of problems. And so for the most part, in a Methodist way of thinking, in the way that they, or at least the way that they conceived of sin, or the way in which they conceived of the problem of social ills, or the problem of crime, or the problem of poverty, or whatever it might be, they would have talked about it in terms of the results of personal problems, right? Personal spiritual problems, a lack of conversion, a lack of Christian life, a lack of Christian discipline, particularly in a Methodist context. So for the most part, in the way that they conceived of it doctrinally, it's very similar to the way Wesley would have talked about it. And that really was the kernel that connected the English Methodist revivals to the North American colonial Methodist revivals, which weren't as cleanly Methodist either, right? There's not as much control over who showed up and that sort of thing in the North American context. But the revivals that were led by Methodist preachers, and later in the Asbury era by official Methodist preachers and so on. So not a ton of difference. What really made Methodism successful in terms of its growth and its effect on communities and its ability to draw people in, the movement's ability to keep people, right, to sustain the movement. What really made that powerful, I think, was the personal experience, that people were having tremendously powerful interpersonal experiences through conversion and through lives changed, right, through personal discipline, through the societies that supported each other, through the accountability built into the society, class and band movement, that sort of stuff. That's what gave it its power, and that's what gave it its what allowed it to sustain itself, I think. None of that really included thinking about society as something outside of the church, or thinking about problems as something outside of the problem of conversion. It's a fairly narrow way of understanding what's wrong in the world, or what's happening in the world, and thus how you fix it. So there's not, in the early days of Methodism, late 18th century, early 19th century, there's not, a board of let's fix this as we might have now, right? Different kinds of boards and agencies that are addressing specific issues, specific problems, that kind of thing. It's just a very different way of understanding the relationship of religion, Christianity, Methodism in this case, and its point in the world. And let me go back to slavery as an example to make the point. So in the earliest disciplines, so from 1784, for barely a decade, so two versions of the discipline after that, you have owning slaves is against the discipline. But once it became apparent that the spread of Methodism was going to be curtailed by that rule, then it became, they began to chip away at that rule. So within a decade, Methodists began to step away from their very strong and forceful stance on slavery. Why? I mean, it's quite easy to understand why, and that is just that they didn't want to stop the halt in the expansion of Methodism as it became clear that slavery was going nowhere. So I think there was some question in the early days of the early republic, so in the 1780s and 1790s, as to whether there would be a continuing industry in human enslavement. It became very clear by the 1790s that was going nowhere, and that there was a lot of people and a lot of money made on human enslavement. And so Methodists, in step with much of the rest of an emerging American society, white Methodists began to chip away at those disciplines. And we see that easily in the breakaway of the AME, for instance, and then later the AMEZ in the 1790s. Not only were they not being treated as equals where they perhaps had been a decade or so before, but they were in their own discipline watching their brothers and sisters in enslaved systems, not just in the South, of course, but all over, watching the discipline back away from what they understood to be a clear Christian or Methodist mandate. So that, to me, that's an example of how conversion came first, even in what to us would seem an obvious moment where you would go, why are those things mutually exclusive? Societies are changed through individual conversion, full stop. And that's the primary energy and the primary Methodist message that keeps going. So in that way, very similar. That is the way that John Wesley and his group in England had imagined reinvigorating the Anglican Church, and it is the way in which Methodists who are here on this side of the Atlantic imagined spreading scriptural holiness, to quote them, across the continent. It wasn't by abolishing slavery first, it was by converting people first.
Yeah, thank you for the connections between the origins of Methodism in England with John Wesley, and then connecting that to one of its major growth periods in the colonial period, and also in the early formation of the nation. And so, in thinking about sort of the time periods that you just described, start in the late 18th century and the early 19th, how did anything really change beginning, with the Civil War? And so to put just a large question to you, and one that, you can paint as broadly as you want, but how did maybe the events of the later 19th century, so you have the Civil War, but also the beginnings of the social gospel movement, and how did maybe those two things start to potentially change Methodism, or did Methodism just keep, pushing forward full speed with the way that it had always done things? So how did those two late 19th century events start to change Methodism potentially?
Yeah, really important question. And it actually gets us back to my engram point at the beginning, which is when do Christians, and Methodists maybe even in particular, begin using this phrase social justice? When does this phrase seem to appear, or why does it appear when it does in the late 19th century? And the way I answer this in the short version is to say that the Civil War becomes doesn't become, after the Civil War, even though of course it was a crisis during the war, but after the Civil War, particularly for white Christians in all denominations, but the Methodists maybe more so than others, because Methodist Episcopals understood themselves to be primary carriers of Christian civilization in the 19th century. But it was a profound theological crisis on multiple levels. So for theologians, for pastors, for bishops, for those in leadership in the Methodist Episcopal Church, they had to begin to try and deal theologically with what had just happened. But also on a personal level, so individual Christians in the United States beginning to try and understand how, since they had been so successful or understood themselves to be so successful before the war, why hadn't that solved it, right? So if you go back to what we were just saying before, if conversion is the way that you solve society's ills by fixing its individuals, by assuring yourselves that people who are saved and thus on the road to perfection, in Methodist terms, who have been sanctified or at least are on their way to that, why didn't that sanctify the nation? Because that was the theology before. So it's the war itself, in its utter devastation and in the way in which it divided the United States right down the middle, and so much blood shed and so much property destroyed, even with the emancipation of the enslaved, it was a theological crisis. And so the question for theologians became, what had we done wrong? We got a lot of people in the churches, because Methodists and Baptists, the two most similar in terms of their Christian style and maybe not their specific doctrine, but the way in which revival worked. Methodists and Baptists made up more than a third of Christianity in the United States by this point. So many people were brought in. Why didn't that stop the war? Why didn't it stop the crisis? Many theologians and many pastors were convinced that one of the problems was this emphasis on individual conversion, that there was a better way to understand what the gospel might mean. And you mentioned the social gospel that has become, as a kind of theological movement or a theological school of thought, that becomes the most well-known to those of us in the present. But its primary criticism was about the focus on an individual gospel message. So Rauschenbusch, who is most people refer to as the primary articulator of a social gospel, said that the gospel is applicable not just to people, but to social groups, to societies. And so the gospel comes to heal communities, not just individuals. And so a social gospel is one that says the church itself has to go out and think about what it can do for a community, not just thinking about itself and its own internal problems, and not just redistributing the sawdust every week so that people can walk the sawdust trail to the altar to recommit their lives every Sunday. Right? That they're not saying that's useless, but they are saying it is inadequate. Rauschenbusch and others would say more. They would have said it actually got us to the war, that it was actually the wrong way to think about what the gospel means, and that in the overemphasis on individual conversion, it completely missed what was staring everyone in the face, which was this societal sin of human enslavement. Right? So that movement is really a direct result of the reflection after the Civil War, this really deep, broad reflection about where the failures had been. And it's interesting to me, I don't feel like most churches have gone back and dealt with this part of the question, but on what actually was wrong about the measures of success prior to the Civil War. So there's a Methodist chapel in every town, in every state, and in every territory in the West, and so on. And there was a lot of self-satisfaction around that. But was that the right way to say that the Methodist message was successful? That became a really important part of the critique, but it has not really stuck, I would say. As Methodists and most other Protestant denominations continue to lament decline, and this sort of golden era of numerical dominance continues to play in the imagination of Methodists, I feel like this question of, well, are those the Methodists that you think should have been counted? Right? That maybe is a better question. What does it mean to say that the high point of Methodist growth was during the era of enslavement and included people who owned other humans? Right? I think to go back and rethink what Methodist success has meant is to rethink what decline and failure might mean now. It's a really strange thing that both ends of the ideological spectrum in Methodism deal with. And that is, what does it mean to say that you might actually act yourself out of power? What does it mean to say, both as a liberal and a conservative and all the other millions of people in the middle, to give up a sort of social and cultural influence in order to do what they think they ought to do? How much of that version of success remains in the Methodist DNA around worries about decline? So you weren't asking me that question, but I think much of what has happened to the critiques post-Civil War have been muted because of the continued sense that decline is the last thing anybody wants to see.
No, yeah, I think everything you said is absolutely fascinating, because I think most oftentimes we think of, whether it be denominational or personal success. I think that's something that has been instilled in us, and this might, be something coming from, or Protestant or Puritan, context here in America, but something that is just ultimately to be strived for no matter what. And if you sell your soul to achieve that success, you're left with one thing but without the other. And so to think about that in terms of a Methodist context, if we're only looking at, you said, at the numerical outputs as measures of success, but yet we leave behind a morality that calls for actual justice. What are we left with? So to move then into the 20th century, maybe looking at such movements as the civil rights movement, but also the actual movement for women to get the vote, and also maybe I think Methodists had a hand in the Prohibition era, with a huge hand in that. I just bring that up to maybe talk about different movements that started maybe to continue this change that we talked about post-Civil War, but how Methodists saw their relationship to society and how that continued to evolve and it continued to change. And so are there any movements in the 20th century that stand out to you as significant moments of evolution for the Methodist Church and its relationship to society particularly on issues of morality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's quite a few, and it's an evolution, but maybe less an evolution than just what we recognize now as a very deep split amongst Methodists about what churches are for, about what Methodism is about. And you mentioned probably, we of course have to mention abolitionists as early activists. There are abolitionists, obviously, within the Methodist movement. Black abolitionists, white abolitionists. It's a minority, it's a distinct minority, but they certainly existed. But also you mentioned women's movements and the rise of very activist women within Methodism. They were active in Prohibition, absolutely. Active in work with the poor. And I don't want to say work on poverty, because again, social thinking or systems thinking is somewhat later. But the deaconess movement in the 19th century is very much focused on addressing social ills. In the 20th century, it changes a little bit, and you get this emergence of thinking about systems and thinking about how Christians might affect social, legal, cultural change. And one of those is around the labor movement in the early 20th century. Methodists are highly active in the early 1900s and the 19-teens on things like labor laws, which is like banning child labor, laws around the work week, 40-hour work week, that sort of thing, minimum wage laws, safety in factories, that kind of stuff, things we just take for granted now. Out of this social gospel thinking, Methodists began to think about their influence, and this is where scale has its uses, right? Methodists were top of the heap when it came to numbers, and because of Methodist polity, unlike Baptists, for instance, there's this centralized core where resources can be combined, where you can take advantage of scale, and there's a kind of pressure that can be exerted on politicians, can be exerted on government agencies and that kind of stuff. So the flip side of the numbers game is that it has its uses, right? And Methodists took full advantage of that, including being central to the push for prohibition, as you also mentioned. So that stuff gets going pretty quickly in the early 20th century. It also then highlights the really deep divide amongst Methodists about what the gospel's for, what the gospel means. And so what we would understand now is this ideological split around the church being a primarily social service agency versus a church that is spreading the gospel. This is where it comes from. It really comes out of this era. What people are familiar with language-wise of the fundamentalist modernist fight comes out of the same era. It's not really centered in amongst Methodists, but it certainly affects and reflects what Methodists are going through at the same time. Later in the 50s and the 60s, many Methodists, and I don't want to say majorities, but significant numbers of Methodists are fully at their core kind of in the liberal camp by this point. And so they're supporting civil rights causes. They're marching with groups like Martin Luther King and others, Jr., who are in Alabama and running marches down south and so on. So the way in which Methodists begin to conceive of what they're for and what it means to spread scriptural holiness, really. I mean, they've abandoned that language at that point for the most part, but it's the same concept about spreading scriptural holiness as a way to heal communities, but just not focused on this individualist thinking. At the same time, the denomination itself seems to be behind at every point when it comes to institutional change, right? The creation of the Methodist Church in 1939, which I spent a lot of time writing about, that was itself a step back in terms of the church's relationship to egalitarian thinking. It's even in its relationship to women being preachers, right? There were women in the Methodist Protestant Church who had to take a step back because of that merger in 1939. And even finally, when women are given the chance at ordination in 1954, when the first one happens, it's not a big church movement. It kind of happens quietly, and then suddenly it's there, and then everybody goes, well, I guess it's time. We're behind everybody else, that kind of thing. So there's a way in which, despite there being a very active wing of social justice systems thinkers amongst Methodists, there's the denomination itself is continually held back by its deep division over this issue. And so the central jurisdiction doesn't disappear until the merger in 1968. 1954, that's not that long ago for women in Methodism to finally being given ordination. It really isn't. So there's like in most denominations, there's a faction who are thinking differently about the relationship between the church and social change and social issues. And the institution itself, like most large institutions, is sort of deeply conventional and slow to make any real movement. And Methodism, because of its polity and its centralized structures, and its fairly even split in terms of its makeup, finds itself reacting later. Make the obvious connections that you will to the contemporary movement, because they're there, right, over the fights over LGBTQI issues, human sexuality in the church. It's very much what Methodists have seen over and over again. And also highlights the same splits we're talking about. When I hear theologian opponents to the changes that are being proposed for the United Methodist Church, they go right back to the language of holiness, of social holiness, and of individual holiness. And that's being used as a way to talk about LGBTQI lives as sinful. And so we go all the way back again to central Christian debates in these ideological divides, which is what's the Bible, what's the nature of the Bible, how do we understand it, what is the nature of the gospel? Not new central issues, but new ways in which these problems or these differences become manifest in the contemporary society. Sorry, I bumped my camera.
That's all right. So now that you have covered all of Methodist history and caught us up to, the current moment, the last question that I want to ask you is a question that pertains to this moment, but it is also one of these larger questions that we have just about the genre of history in general. And so we started, or the first question that I asked you was about John Wesley, and I talked about how maybe starting with John Wesley seems the most appropriate place to start as Methodists. And that seems to be where so many current debates are focusing on, the discussions that we've been having and the discussions we'll need to continue to have about how we function as the United Methodist Church and how we relate to our issue in accepting and including LGBTQIA folks. So the question that I want to ask is, when we start to talk about trying to get back to the ideas of a founder or the ideas of someone who had a very significant hand in the formation of a movement, of whether it be a denominational movement or just some type of movement in history, these conversations that we have about trying to get back to the ideas of that founder, it could be formulated as, what would John Wesley do? Those types of questions, are they misguided questions that keep us from having discussions, that keep us from having more important discussions, such as, what is wise? What ought we to do as Christians? What ought we to do as Methodists? And so the larger question, I guess, is, how do you view discussions about founders and their intentions and their actions in relation to current day? And so that manifests itself as the specific question for Methodists. How do you view these conversations about trying to do as John Wesley would do in relation to, are those the questions we really should be asking? Sorry if that's a muddled question, but yeah.
It's not muddled, but it is a big question. And answerable, I hope, in a short form. My first comment on this is, and a lot of this comes from teaching Methodist history for almost 2 decades, sometimes twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year. So in other words, hundreds of people who understand themselves as United Methodists and in some way have great affection for the denomination, for the tradition. Almost universally, demographics aside, those students have come into my classrooms, and the thousands of people, in churches and so on, who have heard me talk about this as well, or read about it. They come to the history with an expectation that there's going to be some sort of reassurance or some sort of lessons there available to them readily for positive movement forward, right? That the function of history, and this is a product, I think, both of an American context, but certainly of a Methodist context. Methodists are deeply, the Methodist identity is deeply ingrained in narrative and story. The discipline begins with a narrative of who the movement is. Wesley was very intent on writing narratives of what the movement was, how it became what it was. These are very defensive narratives he writes in the 18th century to make a case for the movement, right? So there's a kind of a form of history that's built into people's expectations. And that form is that the history itself will give you a reason to be, and will give you hope, and will give you form, and will give you lesson, and will give you inspiration. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with that unless that's the only thing you expect out of how people have behaved in the past, right? Why? Like, what in our contemporary life would make you think that always looking back, there's going to be people have just behaved well and that they consistently behave well? This is not something we should expect. So in other words, to expect from history that it will give you only good sets you up for disappointment. And so I think what we have to do more generally is to think differently about what the purpose of historical reflection is for. What is it that we are looking for from the past? What are we expecting from it? I've been using this example for about a year and a half or so because there was in the news a few reports coming out of, well, let me start it this way. About a year and a half ago, I began seeing reports from people who give guided tours of old Southern plantations. So docents, museum guides who are giving tourists little brief histories and guides around big plantations. So the big plantation houses, the mansions and the gardens and all these beautiful things. And these reports that people were getting angry because in the last few years, many of these places have readjusted the way that they present plantation life to its visitors to be less about the furniture and the beautiful dresses and the kind decorum amongst the slave owners or the plantation owners, and a de-emphasis on the life of the enslaved and the people who actually work the plantation. So there's all these reports coming out of people being angry. Stop talking about the bad parts. I came here to look at the furniture, right? I came here because I love formal gardens. I came here because I love plantation architecture from the 1830s. And so what we began to see were these online forums of people being angry that their docent focused too much on the hard parts of plantation life. It has become for me a kind of a perfect analogy for what it's sometimes like to teach Methodist history in a seminary. And that is, yes, I know that there was human enslavement. I know that we enslaved people. But what I really want to hear is what the hymns were like in the 1830s, right? I just want to know more about some of the good quotes I could have from John Wesley. I want to hear about all the people that Asbury converted. So those parts aren't false. It's not like Wesley didn't say some useful things or that Asbury didn't have some really important things for us to notice. But the idea that human enslavement is simply a piece of it that can be set aside, we don't do that anymore, right? So we don't really need to talk about it anymore. That's the same problem, I think, in the way that often United Methodists think about their own history. If you put it all together and get rid of the notion that the history is not just there to make me feel good about myself, the history is not just there for us to make a rationale for our own existence. The history is not just there, in other words, for us to make the case to be the most important denomination in the United States, or whatever the rationale needs to be. But the history is what it is, and that there is something to be learned about human behavior. There is something to be learned about the ways in which denominational ambition can destroy that denomination. There are ways to understand what it means to think about from the past, how has a denomination articulated its mission based on what its goals were. I mean, we could go on and on. It's not a plantation, right? It's not a plantation tour where you go to think about the beautiful gardens and the nice furniture. Of course those things exist, but what's more important and more useful is that there's an immensely huge and overly decorated mansion built by people who were kidnapped, tortured, moved, enslaved, raped, held, right? All of those things are at the same time. Churches all over the United States were built by the prophets of the enslaved, right? Prophets off the system of human enslavement. So what do we do with those things together? It's not an either-or situation. It is not, well, you're right, it's awful, so Methodism needs to disband. That's not the answer, right? It's not one or the other. It's not we deserve to exist, we don't deserve to exist. That kind of either-or thinking somehow has made its way into historical analysis in terms of the way denominations think about it. But rather, I'm not looking to history to feel better about myself. I am looking to history to understand more about why this is happening right now. Why? Why is it so hard for us to understand what is happening on the streets? Why did people respond to the very public death of George Floyd in the way that they did? Why do the police exist in the way that they do? Well, the history of that is that the police in the United States came from the era of chasing escaped slaves, right? That is deeply connected to this core sort of original sin for the United States and for those churches that did insufficiently address that problem. And so, no, it doesn't tell you shouldn't exist, this history, but it will help you figure out a different way to think about your own existence now. All of it's looking backwards. All history is starting from the present moment and trying to understand why we are the way we are, not trying to preserve a history that somehow seems incongruent with the way in which things have ended up, because that won't answer any questions. That'll only deepen people's divisions. It's like pulling down a statue of Robert E. Lee and saying, don't destroy my history. Don't destroy history. You're erasing it. No, it's not erasing it. It's deciding who you think ought to be honored out of that history, right? Very different things. That may have been more and a longer answer than you were looking for. But I do think there's a larger issue all the way back from what do we tell children in their Sunday school about John Wesley or about the history. Almost all children are protected from the difficult aspects of history in their youth. I don't think that's a smart idea. When I have adults in their 20s come to me and say they had never heard X such and such about the way that Methodism operated in the 19th century, that's a real problem, because then people's identity is already embedded in these sort of rosy narratives of John Wesley being rescued from a fire, and that God somehow chose Wesley, and thus every other word he spoke must be, chiseled into a monument somewhere. That's maybe more than you asked for, but I think I was getting at what you were asking.
It may be more, but every word you said was important, and I think that is a perfect spot to end on, this idea that nobody is trying to rewrite anything or trying to put something out there that is dishonest, but reframing and recontextualizing things in an appropriate manner that tries to flesh out a full, complex story rather than, a simple heroic narrative for individuals and also for congregations. So that is everything that I think I wanted to ask and wanted to talk about. And so thank you so much for taking some time on your morning and for having this conversation. I really do miss our conversations in the classroom, and so I'm happy that we got to have this one last more hoorah. So
it's been my pleasure, Brendan. And anytime you want to talk, you can pull me up, call me. Happy to do it.
Thanks, Dr. Davis. I'm sure if people have questions, I might be forwarding something in your inbox. So
sure thing.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Dr. Davis.
You're welcome.